I remember walking down the road. In fact, the road that I'm talking about is on this video's thumbnail on YouTube. It's a picture of the road I was on many years ago. The Great Sea of Galilee was near us. This was one of several trips that I've taken to the Holy Land, but this one was different because it was just me and a really great friend of mine. I had a lot of contacts in the Holy Land, but we were on no bus with no tourists. We were on our own. And I remember that day. It was in May, many years ago in the mid-90s. The sky was blue, the day was warm. It was just the two of us with backpacks, and we were walking toward Tabga, which is the traditional site of the multiplication of loaves and fish. And that's when I heard music. It was coming from one of these houses. There weren't many of them around, but one of the houses was the only thing we heard as we were walking. Now, when I tell you what song I heard, there may be some of you who have no idea what I'm talking about. It was a number of years ago. It was the voice in the stillness of Tracy Chapman, that great songwriter and singer. And she was singing her song, talking about a revolution. Now, this song reached the top 40s in the United States, but it was a huge international hit. So we're walking toward Tabga, this place of the ancient miracle. And it is Tracy Chapman's voice that just pierces the big silence. Don't you know they're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper. I thought about that moment so many years ago when I was reading today's Gospel. It's from the 12th chapter of Luke. Jesus is speaking about this new era, this new beginning that he is ushering in. Now his disciples hear him and they think to themselves, wow, great. He's going to overturn the government. He's going to overturn the structures that oppress us and the human spirit, our daily life. And it was a huge surprise to them. And for many, it was a huge disappointment that Jesus was not coming for some radical overthrow of the government or changing of institutions. He wasn't there to solve political problems. Jesus knew there was a time and place for many of those things to help the wounded world in need of healing. But the revolution that Jesus was talking about, both then and now, was an inner one. It sounds like a whisper. It begins, Jesus insists, by looking around you at the sign of the times and asking yourself, to what is God calling me right now? For Jesus, the first revolution is an interior revolution. It's one that every one of us must embrace. A new way of listening and looking and seeing where the gospel is calling me to be and how the gospel is calling me to live. And sometimes it can be in a very new, dare I even say, radical way. But the revolution begins quietly with you looking deeply in your life and honestly asking, what needs to change in me? How do I need to expand my vision? Do I only hear what I want to hear? How do I need to listen as Jesus did, more intently? And how can I more intentionally live his message each day? See, this is what the great Catholic reformer and activist of the 19th century, the great writer Dorothy Day, now a servant of God in the church on the path to sainthood, this is what she meant when she wrote, "The greatest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution that has to start with each one of us." See, it's only after we've had a revolution of the heart, and that's not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process in our life. Only when we've had that revolution can we then expand our vision and look outward. Because if you haven't had this interior change, this interior revolution, then the danger is you can just become a good volunteer who does a lot of nice things when you have the time. It's only after that, the interior revolution, that you can understand what it means to be a person with a mission. See, that's what St. Paul is talking about in today's first reading from the letter to the Ephesians, when he says to them to live in a manner worthy of the call you have received. See, our baptism calls us to always be motivated by the gospel, to always be strengthened by prayer, and to always work together to see the dignity of every human person, to make a choice to live that way, to see the world that way, not by the noise of the internet or the conflicting values in our world today. Well, this is the revolution that's heard by others, not like a chant from a bullhorn, but rather like a whisper that begins to grab the attention of others. Don't you know, they're talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. On this day, in 1956, in Budapest, Hungary, the homeland of my ancestors, many students, a great throng of students, took to the streets and they staged a great procession that was to end with them bringing a petition to the government officials, asking them for changes against the oppressive regime that was governing that country. It was backed by the Soviet Union at that time. People flocked to the streets to join these students. And next thing you know, the government leaders got involved and they were inept. And then there were police were involved and there was shooting. And what was a peaceful demonstration became this great Hungarian revolution. Now, it was a short-lived one. And sadly, it went underground, but continued the movement until the 1990s, when communism fell in that country. Also on this date, in 1915, in New York City, that's this picture here, it's on Fifth Avenue, a group of women, 25,000 women, walked the streets to demonstrate for their right to vote. This was part of the great revolution of women's suffrage that took place on this day. Unfortunately, that didn't change anything that day. It took 5 years before the amendment to the Constitution allowed women to vote. But this was part of the ongoing revolution that these women continued to stage, continued to keep alive so that they could receive the right to vote. So 2 revolutions, separated by time and place. Yes, they had necessary protests and marches, but like all revolutions, this was a lot more than clever slogans and banners and chants in the street that made the difference. It was the whispered conversations, the quiet talks to convince others of freedom, to convince others of rights, to convince others of the dignity of every human person. Those quiet, whispered conversations that helped bring about a change. So maybe for today, I'd invite you to maybe turn off the television for a while. If you listen to the radio, shut that off. Maybe put down the newspaper. Maybe also log off from the internet. And I want you to listen to the quiet and listen to your life, not to what's happening in Washington, D.C. or the political scene, not what's happening with the COVID-19 virus, not what's happening with the economy. There will be time for you to look at that and hear that later today. But can you right now be quiet and listen? What is God whispering to you right now? What is God calling you to see, to hear? Not out in the street, but in this quiet whisper of prayer, of meditation, and reflection. To hear that whisper and to respond is nothing short of a revolution.